I have this pre-concert ritual. Well, I wouldn't say that it's by choice, but I usually will throw up before I go on stage because I'm so terrified. My whole body's shaking. You have to force yourself to be vulnerable on stage. You do have to let that guard down and allow yourself that openness. We have so many concerts here that stage fright is a huge, huge concern of mine. Particularly, my first season here was terrifying. And New World is a place that we give concerts every weekend. You have no choice but to get with the program. On average, I spend about 4 hours a day practicing. When I get my music, I'll come back to my apartment. I will usually put on a practice mute and run the entire symphony with my practice mute on and with the recording on the Bluetooth speaker. And if there's any spots that I just can't play at all, then I'll mark it with a pencil, and then I'll go back and work on this stuff slowly. I was born in Austin, Texas. I lived in Austin until I was about 15, and then I moved to Minnesota. I think as far as I can remember, I've wanted to play the violin. For some reason, my parents always said that I was going to be a violinist. It just seemed predestined for me, at least with them. My parents didn't make a lot of money, so when they had any extra funds, they would go to Goodwill and buy me a variety of different violin things, like these little electric violins that are about this big, and when you put the bow on the string, it starts to play like Eine Kleine. There was even a violin ashtray at one point that I received, which was nice. I do feel like maybe I was born to be a violinist, even though that does sound cliche, but what they did definitely helped.
It's great to see you all. Welcome. Let's start with the Tchaikovsky from the very top. So he does not write a crescendo at 2 after B, but then he writes one into the 3rd bar of B. Yes, so this we need to come out. And then he writes one, 4 after B. Da-yum, ba-bum. That was really good. Can we have just the upper strings, 2 after E? Issue is sometimes when we want something to dance and prance, when we have a down bow, you stop the bow and it kills the sound.
Could I suggest that we do down, up, down?
Okay.
Just so we could get some lift,
if
perhaps.
If it's hooked, that's why
it's
we're stopping.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Down, up, down. Yeah, that's much better. Okay. Yes, we keep that. I love this. This is really waltzing. For the firsts and violas, though, you can have more nudge in your hairpins. And then for the trombones, horns, 2 after D. These are like bells that should come out. For this violins, see that line that connects from one to the other. Let's get more connection here. 2 after F, we must be singing through the note more. You are dying on these notes. They're long, but they need to feel growth throughout.
I love Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. It's actually a work that I was pretty unfamiliar with before we started studying it. The darkness in the symphony, it's not lost on me. Tchaikovsky's life was much more difficult than my life, but I really do my best to put myself in those shoes and try to relate my own experiences to them. Yeah, that's what I was gonna figure out. Like, are we gonna do it the second time?
Yeah, when it's fortissimo.
Where was that? Yeah, like. And then the second one. I'm rushing so much. I had a more stressful experience with Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony last season. So when I saw that I was assigned again to Tchaikovsky 5, I was a little bit nervous, and I had a little bit of, is it Tchaikovsky's just a curse for me, So leading into my rehearsal today, I was feeling a little bit nervous, I had my heart racing and stuff. I need to try to keep going up from here with this week's rehearsal, so I have some work I need to do tonight. My mom played saxophone starting in middle school through high school. And my dad, I think he really had a shot at doing something with athletics. He was a basketball star at the school. That all kind of got cut short because they had me when they were in high school. It was kind of an up and down situation. Like, sometimes my family had money. I mean, not like money, but sometimes we could afford to have an apartment. But things like that always went up and down. There was times where we lived in my family's car for a little bit. But I feel like my parents did a really good job of being kind of like a hydraulic system of like catching all of the trauma for me. I started listening to violin recordings pretty early. My mom bought me like a cassette that I would play on repeat, Paganini's 24 Caprices. I believe at the time we were living in the car because I remember being very comfortable in the car and popping the cassette into the player in the car. And I remember the first note, well, I can't even say note because Paganini's First Caprice is just so crazy that it was the first like 20 notes. I was blown away by the sound. It's not the usual string sound. It was something crazier. It was choppy, it was exciting, it was electric. When you play concerts and you look into the audience and you see the amount of young people, it feels very motivating. Even if it's one person changing their life through classical music, I would say that it's like doing its job. It never gets old to see like people's hands and faces just like clapping, and you think like, is that for me? And it is.